Hello and welcome to the Montana Power Podcast. My name is Max Smith. I'm a farmer in the Bitterroot Valley and also one of the three hosts of this show. This show is focused on the lead up to the June primaries because we're really trying to turn up the volume on some voices you haven't heard. Voices that, if amplified by you, could sway this election. Frankly, we need your help. If you enjoy this podcast, we don't just want your rating on iTunes or Stitcher or some as of not yet known podcasting app. We don't care about all of that. We want your engagement as a citizen. We want you to spread the word of this podcast to your friends. Tell them about the Public Service Commission, the issues confronting Montana, and also, tell them about this guy, Dan.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, my name is Dan Carlino. I'm a graduate from the University of Montana here, where I studied environmental studies and wildlife biology. Currently, I organize with many different climate groups in Montana and help start the Sunrise Movement Hub here in Missoula. At the age of 22, I am passionate about fighting for a Green New Deal to guarantee a livable future for my generation and the many generations to come. I am working on that by running for the Montana Public Service Commission here in District 4.
Well said, Dan. Hi, I'm Ryan the Canadian, and I'm here to bring an international perspective to the podcast. I'm also a medical illustrator, but I can't tell you any more than that, which is honestly really frustrating because I'm passionate about my work. But I'm legally prevented from talking about any of it due to the proprietary nature of some of the research projects that I'm involved in. Anyways, that being said, that's probably the last time I'll mention that on the podcast. That brings us to our conversation today with a great activist, 2018 gubernatorial candidate for Vermont, former manager of the Vermont Electric Co-op, and the protagonist of the 2016 documentary Denial, Christine Hallqvist. Hey, Dan, welcome to the show. Sorry about the technical difficulties earlier. I guess,
no worries. Hey, Ryan.
Yeah, no problem. So I guess we're both quarantined in our individual spaces. I'm in my makeshift office in my new rental house that I'm renting out, and I guess you're over in Missoula?
Yeah, I'm in my apartment over here on 4th Street in downtown Missoula area. Just staying quarantined with my cat and roommates here.
That sounds nice. What's your cat's name?
My cat's name is Toulouse. He's a 3-year-old fluffy cat. He goes inside, outside.
Okay.
But he's mostly a goofball. Yep.
Wow. So what kind of... Oh, sorry. I should get to the point. I was going to ask you what kind of goofy stuff the cat gets up to. I guess what we should do now is talk about our first guest and the story behind that. So we actually interviewed her back in November, and then as we delayed the release of the podcast, we got caught in the middle of this, as we all did, the COVID-19 pandemic, and as a result, felt like we'd be remiss if we didn't comment on it, especially in light of one of the comments that Christine had made about how people's frame of mind changes in a crisis, and I see this as a crisis. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I remember I did a campaign event at the Senior Center after the market with Max Smith back a few months ago as well, where we showed Christine Hallqvist's movie where she was the protagonist in it, Denial. And it was pretty interesting because Christine walked everyone through the energy grid and how complicated it is, and then also just worked in how people deny the climate crisis and what actually needs to be done, and then that connection with the energy grid. And then it just seems like another connection with the crisis that we're facing right now with COVID-19. So we called Christine back to have a 2-part interview to kind of integrate that in as well. So it ended up being a pretty interesting conversation with our energy expert.
Yeah, and I would also say that this is sort of similar to climate change in some ways. I'm not sure, maybe it's a tenuous connection, but in that people with climate change, people similarly aren't used to the idea of exponential growth. I don't know if you know what I mean.
Right. I feel like people are just denying it right plainly, the science in their face. People just don't want to accept it because it's hard to accept the fact of how extreme it is with climate change. And feel like it's been a little bit similar with the COVID-19 at first. Like in the U.S., the government and most people just didn't want to accept the reality of how fast this thing spreads, and I think there's definitely a connection there.
Yeah, no, I would say so. So Christine, she talks about the smart grid, and I guess that's what we're going to start with the first interview, and then the second half of the interview, we're going to delve into how she thinks that we can
such a long time. So when we throw a switch, we expect it to go on. When we turn on our toaster, we expect it to go on. Now, everybody, if you think about everybody, we all get up about the same time of the day and we go to work and we all turn on our toasters and we do all these. We're all in this behavior, which is pretty much, a wired behavior for us. So we've designed this energy system to handle what are called peak loads. So, unfortunately, we waste a lot of energy. If you look at our entire energy system and you start with 100 units of energy, we throw away 65 units of energy even before it gets on the power line. And then, of course, it loses another 10 units. So by the time you get to your house meter, you've thrown away 75 units. So we have plenty of room to optimize our system by utilizing smart communications with the end appliances. So you think about, I'll use the most simple example to talk about this. Let's talk about an electric vehicle. You go to bed at night, you plug in your electric vehicle. You don't care when it charges. As long as you get up in the morning, you can drive it to work, right? So if everybody plugs in their car at 5 p.m., essentially, and we're all running on electric, essentially the grid's going to collapse.
Right.
So what we want to do is communicate with those cars to say, hey, Sammy, your car charges at 12 between 12 and 2:30 in the morning. Sally, your car charges at between 10 and midnight. And start having this interactive communication so we can start optimizing the entire system. Now we have the technology. You think about your cell phones and all the apps we have. Mm-hmm. We don't have to think about that. We can have our appliances have the communication, and we can send price signals. The pricing is directly related to the load. So if you look at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Southern California, an office building is paying 33 cents a kilowatt hour. But if they bought that electricity in the middle of the night, it'd be only 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you could take and use storage and move these things around, you could, first of all, save a lot of money. And oh, by the way, we could start utilizing our renewables more efficiency. So let me move over to trying to run our world on solar. Let's say, I'm going to give you a rough number. It's actually a little lower than that. The Northeast, we have about a 20% capacity factor in solar. So the average in Vermont, we only average about 4.2 hours a day of solar the entire year round. Mm-hmm. So to think about trying to run the whole business on that kind of a system, well, in order to provide the whole day, you need to have like 6 or 7 times the amount of solar you need in order to gain as much energy during those sunlight hours.
Right.
And then distribute it for the rest of the time. Now, our grid can't handle that. You'd have to build a grid, and it'd be so expensive. Mm-hmm. But if we could start communicating with appliances, we could start optimizing that system. I'll give you another example: a hot water heater. Most people, they don't know when their hot water heater turns on, but there's this thing called a dead zone in the hot water heater. So, you set your hot water heater for 120 degrees, and it'll actually heat up to about 123 degrees and then drop down to 117 degrees. That whole dead zone is a place where you can play, and the end consumer doesn't even know what's happening. So what you do is you got millions of hot water heaters out there. You have them all talking to each other and optimize those. So it's about having the appliances communicating with the grid. And then, oh, by the way, if you've got excess solar, if you've got excess wind blowing at the same time, then you take all these devices and say, okay, everybody charge right now because we have an excess of power. And then when we need power, you tell everything to just cycle back down. So the smart grid is a critical component of getting to an optimal system that will allow us to add more renewables. Does that make sense? Did I explain that in a logical enough way?
Absolutely. I think that breaking it down to when the sun is shining and stuff like that, and then recognizing the problem with battery storage currently really shows that the need for a smart grid and seeing when and where we use different amounts of energy is the exact reason that we need that. And I wonder what it would take to implement that wide range in Montana or in Vermont, for example, to get everyone a smart grid meter.
Here's what happened in Vermont. You always need the pioneer. We were the pioneers. We put in the smart grid in 2005. The rest of Vermont didn't start putting it in until 2011. I actually personally wrote, that was part of the stimulus funds, and I actually was the person who wrote the stimulus funding grant for Vermont. So I was very active working collaboratively with the rest of the state to get smart grid going. However, we had a public service commission. Actually, in Vermont, we have this thing called the Department of Public Service, which is the consumer advocate. They were putting lots of pressure on the rest of the utilities to put in the smart grid. The utilities didn't like it.
No.
But I do think, it's one of these things where you've got to keep the pressure on. But at the same time, and I think that's the job of the commission. We have to insist we're going to get there. But however, that said, the part, you'll see later on where I started backing off from these renewable goals. The problem is, I'll go back to what I talked about in the beginning, where I talked about thousands of Vermonters and not even on the list of concerns. We are not feeling enough pain yet. America's not ready. You think about a carbon tax or things like that, you're going to get killed for trying to pass something like that because we're still in love with our fossil fuels. If you saw the movie, there was a statement from the psychologist, a really powerful statement. Yeah. I didn't like it when I heard it first, but it took me a while to warm up to it. But it's the truth. The greatest predictor of change is misery. Now, for me, knowing the studying I've done on climate change, if you look at where we are today, the Earth has had 5 major extinction events, 4 of which were carbon fueled. The last carbon fueled event was called the Permian extinction event 250 million years ago. 85% of the land species and 95% of the marine species were totally wiped out. And our carbon dioxide is increasing 10 times the rate of that event. And I went to the first Intergovernmental Climate Change Commission. 10 times? Yes, 10 times that rate.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's the biggest worrisome with me with the climate crisis right now is the mass species extinctions that we're in the middle of. And
we're in the middle of a major extinction event. So what I'm going to say is I truly believe in the next 5 years, America is going to feel enough pain that it will be on people's that it'll get easier for those of us who are trying to lead the change to make the change happen. You know what? There's one thing I will say I've learned in life. There's the power of constancy of purpose cannot be overcome. We have to remain. If the Public Service Commission has to keep the pressure on, you got to work with your legislature. You got to do the advocacy work. Right now, I've decided also. Immediately after my campaign, I got on the 350 Vermont board, which is a 350.org, because I realized we have a lot of work to do to educate the public about the dangers that we're facing in the climate crisis. But our job right now is to keep the pressure on, just like I'm not pulling any punches now. I spoke to 4 different universities in the past month, And I make it very clear we're in a crisis. We have to be honest about the science. The science is there, and we have the truth on our side.
Why are we wasting our resources? Why do we have such inefficient energy systems? Unquestionably, the ultimate goal is we've got to come into balance with our energy picture. What balance means is we only use the amount of energy on a daily basis that we gain from the sun plus geothermal. That's it. Anything else is working outside of our natural cycle and we'll be in trouble. This is what this is all about. We have all this infrastructure, and I think there's a better way. When we got down to that iPhone, which has more compute power than the entire country did when we landed on the moon, in your hand, you did that because we figured out how to get better than 99% efficiency in that phone. So we've done it. When we do that with our grid, we got more power than we could ever consider needing.
After Katrina, the Katrina crisis was the crisis of the Bush administration. And, I think we all learned from the Katrina crisis, and the country, if you look at most of the electric utilities and the emergency responders that were paying attention, adopted the protocols of the National Incident Command System. And there's a whole set of protocols and procedures that go with that. It's a very good procedure. And of course, our company, we adopted that as well. So what you do, I might have been the CEO of the company, but when a storm hits, you assign an incident commander. And the incident commander essentially takes over at that point. And the idea of the incident commander is the person with the expertise. So, of course, in the electric utility, the incident commander is typically the chief operating officer. So when a storm hits, I no longer, as a CEO, lead the company. I follow the lead of the incident commander, who is the chief operating officer. And, I would expect in a situation like we have today that somebody like Dr. Fauci would be the incident commander, and the president would fade into the background. But of course, that's not what's happening. What we're seeing is the skills in this particular area, who's continually trying to lead this, which is really not the way you should handle a crisis. You really want to turn the crisis over to the experts.
Yeah, no, exactly.
So that's really what I'm observing here is we're a complete lack of protocol in this crisis. Now, of course, there was a lack of protocol during Katrina,
Right.
but we all learned from that.
Yeah, who would have thought it could have gotten worse?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm from Canada, and watching from there, it sure seemed like an unmitigated disaster. I mean, they pulled it.
Oh, and Katrina?
Yeah.
Katrina? Yeah, Katrina was an unmitigated disaster. But it taught us all some lessons. It taught us lessons that we all, when you're first responders and you're working on a crisis, that you all follow a standardized procedure. And for many, many years, we spent years and years and years as a country agreeing to the standards of the National Incident Command System. And it seems like the Trump administration either is totally unaware of it or Trump just totally ignores it, or his personality doesn't allow him to surrender to the experts.
Yeah, it sounds almost like he's more concerned about getting elected and listening to his wealthy donors than he is about actually doing anything that's in the best interest of the public.
Yeah, that's really interesting that they have that protocol in place, and it now seems like the time to use it more than ever. So that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, I think if anybody's listening, I should say for those who are listening to this podcast, and who are emergency responders, they're probably aware of the National Incident Command System and the protocols. So I think those of us that are, in the business of crisis response, I think it's safe to say we all know how to do this, and it's not being done the way it should be done.
Wow. Yeah. I had no idea that even existed. I mean, that would be a nice thing that would be very reassuring for the public, I think, if that actually was explained in that way.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you, I promise you, that if the president was using the National Incident Command System, there would be very little panic. There'd be a solid level of confidence. It really is. We all understand crisis. I think any of us who have been paying attention, we expected at some point we would see some kind of virus like this. We've been talking about this for years. We've been talking about pandemics, preparing for pandemics, tabletop exercise for pandemics. In my company, we have a OP-60. It's Operations Procedure 60, which was a pandemic response procedures. So I really think that the chaos that's happening right now can be traced right back to the lack of stable and responsible leadership following a standardized process. If we had that now, I think things would look a lot different.
So I think you've said before that, and this is something you've had trouble accepting, but that the greatest predictor for change is human misery. And do you think this is a pivotal moment for the country? And
I'm positive it's a pivotal moment for our country.
so,
I think this is as big, or even bigger than the Great Depression. We're all going to come out of this changed.
And what role do you see people like Dan, like young politicians? What role do you think they could have to play in reshaping the future and not allowing people like Naomi Klein talks about disaster capitalism, and she's recently talked about coronavirus capitalism. What role do you think people like Dan have in pushing a positive agenda that will allow us to have a livable future?
Well, let me just say that to simplify things, we could go in two directions, and I'm on the optimistic side of the direction. One direction is total chaos, civil war, breakdown of the entire system. I don't think America's going to do that. I think what's going to happen is people we're going to come out of this with a lot more empathy. When I talk about empathy, I talk about that's going to shape our tax policies in the future. That's we're going to learn. We're going to learn how important things like Medicare for all is as a result of this. I think people like Dan should be just prepared to ride out the storm, and coming out the other side, I think there's going to be a lot more willingness to look at socializing medical costs, for example. I think unfortunately, this is the misery that creates the great change, but we are in the midst and the middle of it. I'm very optimistic that we are going to come out of this with a reset.
Right.
And I don't think it's not a morbid thought, because the point being, all of us who have a positive outlook and are always looking forward, we recognize that crisis and things happen that are beyond our control. But the wisdom comes from making the changes that are necessary as a result of the learning that comes from those bad things that happen.
Right. The time for change after a crisis like this pandemic is very ripe. And you mentioned the Great Depression, and there was large changes in the government following that, with FDR and the working class pushing for these changes, such as what led us to having the New Deal, where we still see some of those programs like Social Security and job help still out there today. And I feel like with the climate crisis coming upon us, and the pandemic, crashing the economy, and all of this put together, the time has never been more ripe for a Green New Deal following this pandemic and economic crash. What are your thoughts on a Green New Deal to help pull us out of this?
Yeah, so I've evolved on the Green New Deal. Before this crash, I don't think the Green New Deal would fly, but I do believe the Green New Deal will fly. And and there's some of the criticisms, I probably did this right on the last podcast. I criticized the Green New Deal because it was trying to be too expansive. It was trying to focus on economic justice issues. But I think economic justice issues, as a result of this, will be number one, right, and will be a number one focus. And I think tying, the climate with those economic justice issues is the way to go. Before, when I talked to you before, I was focusing on the climate as number one.
Right.
But I think what we're going to do is focus on economic justice as a number one, with climate as a carry-on issue. Because I think we're going to see so much pain in the next couple weeks and months. And I do believe 95% of people are good. And I'll give you a great example. I was talking to my spouse the other night. She gave all of her hours away. She works supporting elder people, and she has her own client base. But she gave her clients away to somebody else who basically is running on the lower rungs of the economic ladder and struggling and doesn't know what to do. I'm certainly willing to give up income. I know we are willing to give up income to help others, and we did it, but we are doing it. And I think most people are the same. And I don't think this is just an American thing. I think it's deep down, it's the goodness of humanity. Mm-hmm. We're all willing to give to help others, I believe. And I think this crisis is going to bring that out.
I really hope you're right about that, Christine. That is a good perspective to have.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And what would you make of the idea that for instance, we brought up disaster capitalism. Like, I've heard talk that the Trump administration, this was according to the Washington Post, is thinking of bailing out numerous shale companies. And in Canada, they're actually already preparing a $15 bailout, a $15 billion bailout package for the oil and gas companies. But yeah, so what do you make of that in light of the fact that in the past they've said things like, "Oh, we can't have renewables because it's not feasible from a financial perspective." But if we keep, if now these things are not solvent, then is there any impediment standing in our way of actually, reinvesting this money in green technology? Does that make sense?
Well, of course, I think that would be the right way to go. And what we're witnessing as we speak in terms of the struggle in Congress with the bailout bill is directly related to what you're talking about. So there's a group of people that believe in the Green New Deal and are supporting that, and that are really disturbed about the fact we're bailing out the oil companies. But unfortunately, America hasn't learned enough, or America or the world, probably, let's focus on America right now. We haven't suffered enough misery directly tied to the climate to give up on our fossil fuel addiction yet. This crisis isn't directly tied to climate change. People can't make that direct connection. Mm. So of course, it's upsetting to see money going to the oil companies. However, that said, as we get months into this crisis, I believe people are going to be much more upset about the fact that we're bailing out large companies and large businesses at the expense of those people of the working class. Those people work on the lower end of the income ladder. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of us coming out with greater empathy. There's going to be less tolerance for that extreme wealth. I truly believe this is going to result in dramatic changes in the tax code, which, by the way, if you go back to the Great Depression and FDR, that's exactly what happened after the Great Depression. So we saw FDR come along with all these programs, including the rural electrification program. And I should put a plug for Winston Churchill too at that point. If you look at and again, if Trump was following the National Incident Command System, which is something I did exactly, whenever there's a crisis, the best thing for the leader to do is be out in the field and being very visible in the epicenters of the crisis. And that's what Winston Churchill did, of course, in World War II and after World War II. And that's why Winston Churchill became the great leader that he was, because he understood the leader's job. The leader's job is to be out there and be the representative, and that actually becomes a calming force.
Right.
Somebody should tell that to Joe Biden. Sorry. I don't know where.
Yeah.
I don't
we
know
don't know what's going on with Joe Biden, right? Jesus.
I hope he's okay.
Well, yeah. I mean, I got to wonder too. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but holy cow, maybe that. Who knows what's going to happen?
I don't know. Like the closest thing we have to FDR, in a sort of tangent, this is about Dan, but the closest thing we have to FDR is Bernie Sanders, and he's done an amazing job. And this is said by somebody who can't even vote in this country. And oh well.
One other subject I wanted to get.
Well, let me just say too. I want to plug on that one. I think if this crisis had come 4 months earlier, Bernie would be the candidate right now.
Yeah.
Right.
The timing was just off for Bernie.
Yeah, it's really sad.
It's quite disappointing. But the time isn't up. And one other thing I wanted to get your opinion on, Christine. We did a PSC candidate forum here a few weeks ago, and I've been talking about this throughout the campaign, but I announced just that we need to look into putting our energy grid into public ownership. That way, the people that are wanting renewables would help push for it easier than going through this for-profit monopoly that has doubled their profits in the past 5 years, and then putting more of that money back into lowering people's bills rather than going to the profiteers. And I'm curious what your thoughts on public ownership of the energy grid are, and how you think that would affect the transition to renewables, and how that would affect people's energy prices.
Well, being the fact that I was the CEO of an electric cooperative, and I was a leader in the National Rural Electric Cooperative System, which serves 56% of the landmass of America. I'm a big advocate for public power. I do think public ownership would help us a lot, and let me tell you why. Because what I found, and I've talked, in my travels, I talked with a lot of investor-owned utility managers versus public power managers, and there's a big difference when you're a public power manager. When you're an investor-owned utility manager, you're focused on the quarterly dividend, and that's what you focus, quarter to quarter to quarter. One of the things I found very refreshing about public power is that there's definitely an eye to the long term. You could talk 10 and 20 years out in public power, and that's really how public power talks. So I think renewables does have a greater opportunity for success if utilities are publicly owned. And of course, during my campaign, I pressed public ownership of telecommunications facilities because, America is 10th in the world in terms of telecom. Those leading countries in the world have publicly owned telecommunications facilities. So there's clear data that shows that public ownership provides a better product. And, to counter those people that might accuse me of being, they would accuse me of being a communist. When you hear people say, whenever you hear people accuse you of being a socialist, they're really talking about communism.
Yeah.
Of course, we're not a communist, but I will tell you, socializing investments with infrastructure actually creates better capitalism. And so socializing electric power is just like socializing your roads. You know, none of us complain about the fact that we pay for the roads with our taxes, and the United States has long had a very good transportation infrastructure, and it's always been publicly owned.
Right.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I'm speaking about the automobile.
Yeah, unfortunately, it'd be nice if we had some light rail or other alternative modes of transportation. And yeah, you're hardly a communist. And I'm from British Columbia, and we have we used to have, I think we have some private public partnerships, but as far as I know, the BC Hydro is still publicly owned. So Canada isn't exactly a communist country. So
no, of course not.
It's so absurd, the things you hear. Anyways, yeah. But Dan, did you have any other questions? I guess just addressing sort of where we go moving forward. It's probably hard to really put into words right now. I mean, this crisis is just unfolding right now.
Right.
Well, I think Dan, are you running for office or are you in office?
I'm running for the Public Service Commission here, not in office right now.
Well, I mean, I think the point for any leader right now is compassion and empathy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, compassion and empathy getting us through this crisis. And what I mean by compassion and empathy it's compassion for it's people like me, sitting here living with my 88-year-old mother, or compassion for anybody that's exposed to the virus, which is really all of us. So I think we're all in the same boat right now, and good leadership right now is all about compassion and empathy.
Right.
Well, that's really yeah. Sorry.
And then when you get to the other end of this, that's the time to start looking at the policies that need to be reformed as a result of what we learned in this crisis.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. I guess the whole key is getting through this and the best we can, and hopefully our leaders that we currently have that same empathy that Dan has and other upcoming leadership in the country has.
Yeah, if you're, I've been of course, I'm in New York State right now, so I've been watching Cuomo a lot. Governor Cuomo really has this empathy thing down good. Every one of his updates, he includes, a great deal of time talking about, issues we can all relate to and bringing people in who are experiencing the same things we are.
Yeah, that is good. Although I'm slightly disconcerted by the talk he has of bringing people back into the workforce too early. So hopefully, cooler heads prevail on that one. Pardon?
I kind of missed the news cycle today on that one, but that is disconcerting.
Yeah, I mean that's something I've heard, but I don't know. Yeah. Anyways, I don't have any citations. I think it's out there. So hopefully he doesn't do that. But
yeah, I wonder who's really worried about the financial collapse. We've got this dialogue going on right now about it really what the dialogue boils down to is what's the value of a human life.
Right.
Which is, to me is an absolutely horrendous dialogue that we're even having. But I'm not the billionaire. so I look at the stock market crash and say, okay, that's certainly not going to kill me, but the coronavirus will.
Right. Yeah. There's somebody I follow on Twitter, and their comment was, it looks like profit and human life are once again in direct conflict. Let's see which one wins out.
Yeah, I think that's where we are right now. But I think for 95+% of America, I think human life's the priority.
Well, I hope so. I mean, although I really hope so. I do think that's true. But, when people have to go back to work, I guess they have to make tough choices. It's we really do need to restructure the economy in a way that is more I don't know, caring. It's less cold. And anyways, it's yeah. It's something needs to give. Something will give, I guess, at some point.
Yeah, I think it's giving as we witness, as we speak.
Yeah, certainly an interesting time.
Yeah, I really hope this pandemic makes U.S. citizens wake up and politicians to wake up to the social injustices in our country that are still prevalent today before the pandemic and that have been gotten worse after this pandemic. And I hope we make the right decisions. But thanks a lot for coming on again, Christine. It's really interesting getting your perspective on all of this.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was thanks for asking for my perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, really value it. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay, have a great night.
Yeah, have a good night.